Until recently, Anthony Cumia was operating his own media company called Compound Media, which recently merged with Gavin McInnes' Censored Media. And my thesis for this video is that Compound Media could have been a broadcast juggernaut back when it started in around 2014. You see, Anthony was fired from his gig on Sirius XM back in July of 2014 for a wild and offensive Twitter rant, back when it was actually Twitter. This ended the 20-year run of one of the great talk shows of all time, Opie and Anthony. Because Anthony was so controversial and tainted from his firing, he quickly pivoted and created his own podcast platform called Compound Media, which was a lot more of an undertaking 10 years ago or so.
Hi, Anthony Cumia, exiled radio host. Said a few things that offended some people. Well, get ready. The Anthony Cumia Show is premiering August 4th on anthonycumia.com.
One of the reasons why I had the germ of the idea for this video is that a ton of upcoming talent passed through Anthony's company. And also the timing of the creation of Compound Media is very interesting in terms of the media landscape. Compound Media being formed in August of 2014 coincides almost exactly with the start of the Gamergate movement. The term Gamergate was coined in August of 2014, that same month. And Anthony Cumia began full-time broadcasting, and his ex-police officer buddy Keith the Cop and sort of body man was the executive of the network and ran it with zero experience in broadcast media. And they had an all paywall model that was broken from the start, and people from the very beginning offered that sort of criticism, let him know that it was basically a non-starter because he needed to put out, free tester content, or, maybe do a model similar to the way that a lot of Patreon shows do these days, where they do, maybe one free show and one paywalled show a week. It was never a coherent strategy, and the entire thing was destined to slowly decline off the subscriber base of Opie and Anthony superfans, who are a very strange breed if you know anything about Opie and Anthony, the pests. I thought Compound Media was worth reflecting on with the recent full circle moment of Anthony actually being hired back on broadcast media by WABC Radio in New York, which is the first time he's been back in an official capacity on public airwaves after a decade plus of being banished from basically all mainstream platforms after his what was characterized at the time racist Twitter tirade. Very briefly, I'm going to add some context for people that are not super familiar with Anthony or the Opie and Anthony show. I think most people that are arriving to this video are going to probably already get the gist or be very familiar with that world. But just really briefly, O&A was a shock jock radio show that started in the 90s, but later ended up sort of transcending its douchey origins to become one of the most influential talk shows of all time. Joe Rogan, in fact, has often credited O&A and specifically Anthony and Compound Media, which he was doing in irregular broadcasts before he officially created as a podcast platform, with inspiring Joe Rogan's podcast, The Joe Rogan Experience.
You guys had figured it out. It really is the birth of podcasts. And I learned a lot from doing that show. And I also learned that I wanted to do it. Because when I would do your show, I was like, God, I want to do a show like this.
The podcast also pioneered the format of comedians hanging out and having long-form conversations and commenting on clips of YouTube, which was very early in its run during a lot of Opie and Anthony. And, also talking about other forms of media, lots of old movies and just any sort of pop culture goss, and also mixing in celebrity guests with that sort of stew. And that was perfected basically in the 2000s and early 2010s on Opie and Anthony. And basically every podcast that features comedians or anything along those lines has borrowed to some degree or another from Opie and Anthony. One of the ideas for a video that I've been trying to pull together for a long time has to do with how the O.J. Simpson trial had an overwhelming influence on the modern media landscape. I have just like a bunch of like germs of ideas and, half baked and sometimes like almost fully produced stuff in a sort of morgue that I have of things that I'm thinking are sort of evolving. And the Opie and Anthony show is definitely a chapter in that story that I would like to tell at some point. This might just be because of like the overlap of my interests in the O.J. Simpson case, which I'm obsessed with, and the media associated with it, and also my knowledge and somewhat interest in the Opie and Anthony show. But I have like boxes and boxes of. I swear if like I like croak or something like that, somebody's going to think I'm like a serial killer with all like the tabloids, like the National Enquirers and old newspapers I have, magazines, just random ephemera about the OJ trial. But the connection is actually very strong and not just my imagination, because their genesis, Opie and Anthony's genesis, is totally inextricably linked with the OJ Simpson trial and also very much of that era, the mid-90s shock jockery. The story about how Opie and Anthony was created is that at the time, Opie was doing like a late night radio show in Long Island called Opie's Late Night Attitude, which is like just so on the nose. And Anthony at the time was like a tin knocker and HVAC repairman who was in like a small time band with his brother called Rotgut. And Anthony and his brother went on Opie's Late Night Attitude to perform a song parody that they had done that had gotten, I guess, a little bit of local buzz in Long Island that was called Gonna Electric Shock OJ, which was a very of its time spoof of the Otis Redding classic Sitting by the Dock of the Bay. I don't even want to like put a clip in here of that show or like there's like some like music video type thing of Gonna Electric Shock OJ that you can find on YouTube. If you want to find it, I'll maybe link it in the description, but it's so offensive that I feel like I would be permanently banned from polite society for even putting a clip of it at all in here. It features some very insensitive imagery. Anyway, from there, as they were founded in the mid-90s, Opie and Anthony slowly evolved and went on to become like one of the biggest morning radio shows on terrestrial radio in the country. But they kept having their progress upwards hamstrung by like a number of huge controversies, which ended up sort of cutting both ways for them, because they were, every couple of years being like involved in like a huge front page viral news story. The first one was they did an April Fool's prank in Boston where they made up a story about the mayor dying, which was very colorful.
Nino was dead. You weren't imagining it. It was an April Fool's hoax by 2 radio disc jockeys. Tonight, those DJs are apologizing to the mayor. Again,
something that I probably shouldn't talk about the details of. But anyway, they got fired for that. And that actually ended up being a big plus for them, because then they went to New York radio from there and actually became bigger. But while they were in New York radio, a few years later, they got into an even more serious controversy where they were doing a promotion for Sam Adams beer called Sex for Sam, where people would have sex, theater of the mind, radio stuff probably, in various places in New York City where the show was broadcasting. Well, they did a live remote where a couple supposedly had relations in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, and that struck some people the wrong way, like in the early 2000s.
A couple is in jail accused of having sex inside St. Patrick's Cathedral, apparently as part of a radio stunt.
And they were fired. And this firing really kind of put them in the wilderness, because they were under contract for terrestrial radio for like a couple more years. And the radio station like basically kept them on contract, but kept them off the air. So they couldn't broadcast for like 2 years after that. And then eventually they made their way to Sirius, or actually XM radio, before the companies merged. And they were like, on satellite radio before Howard Stern, like a full 2 years before Howard Stern in like 2004. So that, they're pioneers of like the whole internet integration and satellite radio and also terrestrial radio worlds in a lot of ways. And today, most people still remember the show and still listen to old clips of it on YouTube because it featured like hundreds of hours that you can't get anywhere else, with like a unique and incredible roster of comedians like Bill Burr, the late Patrice O'Neill, Joe Rogan, Louis C.K., among many others. So that's the short gist of what Opie and Anthony was and what happened to Anthony. Opie and Anthony existed up until 2014 when Anthony got fired for SiriusXM, involving yet another weird, colorful incident where Anthony went on I guess we'll just say very colorful Twitter tirade after he said he was assaulted in Times Square by a woman. Anyway, it's like anytime Opie and Anthony get involved in a controversy, it's like difficult to even talk about because they're so wacky and like non-PC. But anyway, you can look it up again if you want to find out more context. But basically, since 2014, Anthony has been radioactive for mainstream broadcast platforms. He had to start his own platform, basically, to be able to continue broadcasting. And, a lot of this came back to mind because there's a recent clip on a podcast that I watch frequently called Who Are These Podcasts, which is not coincidentally a podcast that reviews terrible podcasts, which is a bit that is directly inspired by Opie and Anthony, where they did a bit every October called Jocktober, where they would review terrible, hacky morning radio shows. But anyway, the co-host on the show, Adam Bush, who I really enjoy and has made me even more fond of the Who Are These Podcast universe and the Dabbleverse, another weird thing that's too wacky to get into in short length, but they were listening to clips of Opie talking about how Anthony had just got hired on to WABC for broadcast radio, and one of the running threads since Anthony was fired by SiriusXM is there's been this blood feud between the former radio partners Opie and Anthony, and when the news recently broke about Anthony getting hired back on broadcast radio on WABC, which is the biggest AM radio station in New York City, Opie typically downplayed it and trash-talked Anthony and claimed that Opie, was previously offered a show on WABC, but Opie said he turned it down because they wouldn't offer him any appreciable amount of money. Adam Bush had like a really interesting and subtle point with what is said about the difference in mentality between Opie on the one hand, basically only interested in money and what's in it for him to broadcast, and Anthony, how they each approached being on the radio. And Anthony, in Adam's estimation, was more of like an actual artist, somebody that really enjoyed doing broadcasting and would, like I said, he did compound media while he was on Opie and Anthony just because he enjoyed the interaction, broadcasting. He's just a natural broadcaster. He didn't break into the broadcasting business until he was 35 years old because he was, just like a regular average working guy, but he just is so talented that he somehow found a way to make it a career and make millions of dollars in the years that they were allowed to be on their various platforms. And I also thought this spoke a lot about how Anthony ran his company Compound Media. And I thought that there's an important parallel there because when I first sort of had the germ of the idea for doing this video, actually before all this WABC stuff, I had the idea initially to do a video about just how Anthony sort of blew it with Compound Media. But anyway, I want to play a short bit of this clip of Adam Bush discussing the contrast, the compare and contrast between Opie and Anthony. I think that'll add some more context so that we can wrap it up here in the next segment.
That's why Opie is not an artist or a broadcaster of any kind, because all he's measuring is some kind of financial trickery that he can do that might make it seem like it wasn't the greatest investment for a certain period of time. When you're a comic or a musician, you're like, I played guitar on my own terms for a rapt audience every day for 10 years. I won. That's it. You won. He broadcast. He did what he wanted to do. When you have nothing to say and no opinions and no passion, you can just look at that and say, well, it wasn't Joe Rogan, so it's a failure. Why would you ever do anything if it wasn't to just make as much money as Joe Rogan?
So as I mentioned before, the original germ of this idea for a video was a lot less charitable to Anthony. I just noticed that there was like so many talents that have gone on to bigger and better things that have gone through Compound over the years, and that obviously Anthony and Keith the cop were ill-equipped to run it and made a bunch of obvious mistakes. But after hearing Adam and sort of taking that on board and thinking about it for a bit, I realized that if you just evaluate Compound Media in terms of dollars and cents.
If it don't make dollars, you don't make sense. That's a fact, Jack.
KB reference. That it's fair to say that it didn't reach its potential. I mean, it did okay. It stuck around for over 10 years and was a going concern. But if you look at it through the lens that Adam Bush was, and his analysis was proposing of the artist versus the capitalist, the Anthony in all of us versus the Opie, then I think that Compound Media can be seen as, in a way, like an evolution or the next iteration of Opie and Anthony, in that it found and incubated and supported and then launched a lot of talent. Like, Anthony may have let the opportunity for making millions of dollars slip through his fingers, but ultimately it led to the flowering of dozens of careers all over different forms of media these days. And we'll kind of wrap it up here with talking about some of the people that passed through the halls of Compound. But, the thing is that Anthony already has millions of dollars from his run on Opie and Anthony. And, I don't know whether or not it was his intention, but the fact that Opie and Anthony was, the fact that Compound Media was really not good at like locking down talent or sort of wrapping up people in the types of like long-term contracts that other media companies are in the business of doing, to keep their talent on board. It actually led to sort of, I don't know if like maybe like an emergent, unexpected scenario where people ended up using Compound as a stepping stone to make it out of total obscurity, and then probably took away a lot of lessons from witnessing it up close and personal, both good and bad, about how to create their own sustainable business model. In other words, like if Compound Media had cinched up all these talents in long-term contracts, like a similar model to, I don't know, Daily Wire, just because they've been in the news for having weird issues with contracts and their talent, it probably would have stunted people like Shane Gillis's growth if he was tied to a show on Compound long-term. But because Compound Media was run by a totally incompetent ex-cop and a conflict-avoidant radio legend, Anthony is notoriously loath to deal with money or business or any sort of conflict with anybody, the fledgling talent was basically unburdened by any potential legal entanglements or other roadblocks and were left to go on to do other things, like Anthony's longtime co-host for like a few years in there, Dave Landau, went on to, go and work on Steven Crowder, and then had an odd issue there, which how could you not? But anyway, like the list of talent that ran through Compound and has gone on to do their own shows includes people like I said, Shane Gillis, Dave Landau, who's got his own thing going on these days, Chrissy Mayer, Kevin Brennan, who's a crazy man, but has a pretty poppin' live stream these days. Misery Loves Company. There's a lot more that I'll show here in like a montage, but the other big one that I obviously need to mention is Legion of Skanks was, or I think originally, or at least very early on in their show, was a Compound Media show, which is, Louis J. Gomez and Dave Smith, who's like huge these days in political circles, and Big J. Oakerson, who's probably one of the funniest working stand-ups now. And those guys, there's like a sort of infamous incident, and I couldn't find the clip of this, because this was so long ago and it just isn't easily recoverable on the internet. But I did find like a Reddit post that I'll show you a screen cap of. But basically, Legion of Skanks was let go by Keith the Cop from Compound over like what essentially amounted to like a few $100 or something like per whatever month, a pittance, like peanuts of money. And so that's just like a great example of the type of thing that Compound Media was just just totally incompetent in being able to resolve like a normal business. And now Legion of Skanks is on Gas Digital, which is like a much bigger platform than Compound ever was. So this whole thing resolves back onto the contrast of like what being a true artist and being like a mercenary businessman is. Like sometimes you can squeeze every bit of blood out of a stone as the businessman archetype, but that doesn't necessarily lead to better results in the bigger picture if you think about larger societal implications. And obviously this same sort of cycle plays out in many other facets of life besides goofy podcast stuff. And I think it's worth reflecting on, especially in our current milieu. Anyway, there's just like a hopefully short idea for a video that I wanted to get out there because it's timely, and I wanted to wait until Anthony did his first broadcast on WABC, which was great, and now he's broadcasting on WABC every Sunday from 8 to 10, and he just announced that just over a month from now on April 13th on his first live show in New York City, April 13th, 8 to 10 Eastern, he's going to have on Jim Norton, which is very exciting because they were essentially the core, the backbone of Opie and Anthony. It was really the chemistry between Jim and Anthony that made that show what it is. So I definitely recommend checking that out if you're not already aware. So thanks for your time, and I hope this made sense and you enjoyed it.